In the depths of the forest, two hikers, armed with only a branch and a rock, face an unspeakable terror. How will they survive the night against a creature that should only exist in nightmares? Get ready to explore the unknown with every step. Subscribe now for the adventure of a lifetime. I grabbed the branch again, striking it repeatedly, trying to drive it away from her. She joined in using the rock to bludgeon it whenever she could. Our combined efforts finally brought the creature to its knees with one final mighty swing. I brought the branch down on its head. The creature collapsed, its body twitching before finally going still. We stood there panting and covered in sweat and blood, hardly believing what we had just done. The woman, her face streaked with dirt and tears, looked at me with a mixture of relief and disbelief. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I thought I was going to die." "We need to get out of here," I replied, helping her to her feet. "There might be more of them." We didn't waste any time together. We made our way back to the main trail, supporting each other as we moved. The forest seemed to come alive again, the birds singing and the leaves rustling as if nothing had happened. But we knew better. The tranquility was a facade, hiding the darkness that lurked within. When we finally emerged from the forest, we were greeted by a group of hikers who had heard the commotion. They helped us to the nearest ranger station, where we recounted our harrowing tale. The rangers were skeptical at first, but when they saw our injuries and the look in our eyes, they knew we were telling the truth. An investigation was launched, but no trace of the creature was ever found. The campsite we had stumbled upon was identified as belonging to a missing hiker, confirming our worst fears. The forest, once a place of solace and peace, had become a haunting reminder of the encounter. Life returned to normal, or as normal as it could be. After such an experience, the woman whose name I learned was Elise and I kept in touch, bound by the trauma we had shared. We never spoke much about that day, but we didn't need to. The scars on our bodies and minds were enough of a reminder. As for the creature, I don't know if it was really a Bigfoot or something else entirely. All I know is that it was real and it was deadly. The forest still calls to me, but I've learned to listen with a more cautious ear. Nature is beautiful, but it also harbors secrets, some of which are better left undisturbed. And so life goes on. I still hike, still seek the thrill of the wild, but with a newfound respect for the unknown, because out there, in the depths of the forest, there are things that defy explanation, things that remind us how small and fragile we really are. And every time I lace up my boots and step onto a trail, I carry that knowledge with me, a silent guardian against the darkness that lies just beyond the trees. My name is Clayton Monroe and I'm a police officer in Riverton, a town that doesn't make the headlines often. I've been with the force for about 10 years now. Nothing much ever happens here, and I liked it that way. Low crime, friendly folks, a simple life. But last year that all changed. It was a case that left me questioning everything I thought I knew about people. My shift had started, like any other, a mundane afternoon of patrolling the quiet streets of Riverton. It was one of those days where the most exciting thing was a cat stuck in a tree. I remember joking with my partner, Eddie Cartwright, about how we were just glorified dogat catchers. He laughed his big booming laugh, echoing through the patrol car around 4:00 p.m. We got a call from dispatch. A woman named Mary Lindholm had reported her husband, Eric, missing. Apparently he'd gone out for a jog that morning and hadn't come back. Mary was worried sick. I knew Eric not well, but enough to exchange pleasantries. He was a school teacher, the kind of guy who never missed a day of work and was always polite. It wasn't like him to just vanish. Eddie and I drove over to the Lindell residence. Mary answered the door. Her eyes red from crying. She was clutching a crumpled tissue and trying her best to stay composed. "Come in, please. I'm so worried. He never goes off like this." she said, leading us into the living room. Family photos lined the walls showing a happy family: Eric, Mary and their 2 kids. Can you tell us what happened? I asked, pulling out my notebook. He went for his usual morning run around the lake. He always comes back by 9 to take the kids to school, but today he didn't. I called his phone, but it went straight to voicemail. Mary said, her voice trembling. Eddie and I exchanged a glance. Missing adults weren't common here, especially not someone like Eric. We assured Mary we'd do everything we could and set out to the lake. The lake was a peaceful spot surrounded by trees and walking trails. It was popular with joggers and dog walkers. We started our search near the trail Eric usually took as we walked. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The usual chirping of birds seemed quieter. The rustling leaves more ominous. About an hour into our search, Eddie found something: a shoe half buried in the dirt by the side of the trail. It was Eric's, a running shoe with a distinctive blue stripe. Clay over here, Eddie called out. I hurried over and saw the shoe. My heart sank. We radioed in and continued searching, our pace quicker. Now our jokes forgotten. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the trees, we found more signs: a broken branch, a torn piece of fabric, and then near the water's edge, we saw it. Eric's body part partially submerged in the lake. Jesus, Eddie muttered, crossing himself. I felt a chill run down my spine as we approached. Eric's face was bruised and there were clear signs of a struggle. This wasn't an accident. We called for backup and secured the scene. The medical examiner, Dr. Harlan, arrived quickly. He confirmed what we already suspected: Eric had been murdered. Back at the station, we started digging into Eric's life. Who would want to kill a school teacher? He had no enemies, no dark secrets that we could find. His colleagues spoke highly of him. His students adored him, and his neighbors found him pleasant. It didn't make sense. We interviewed Mary again, this time at the station. She was devastated but cooperative. She couldn't think of anyone who'd want to harm Eric. Was Eric acting strange recently? Any unusual behavior? I asked. No, nothing. He was just his usual self. We had dinner last night, talked about the kids' school projects. Everything was normal. She replied, her voice breaking. Days turned into weeks, and we were no closer to finding Eric's killer. The town was on edge and rumors started flying. People speculated about everything, from a random drifter to a jealous lover. One evening, as I was going over the case files for the 100th time, Eddie walked into my office. Clay, I think we need to look at this from a different angle. Maybe it's not someone from outside, maybe it's someone right here in Riverton. He suggested. It was a disturbing thought, but it made sense. If Eric's killer was local, they'd blend in, know the routines, the places to hide. We started re-interviewing everyone, looking for any inconsistencies, any small detail. We might have missed. That's when we found Martha Pritchard, an elderly lady who lived near the lake. She mentioned seeing a man arguing with Eric a few days before his disappearance. She didn't recognize him, but she remembered his face. He was tall, had a scar on his cheek and wore a baseball cap. She said it wasn't much, but it was a lead. We circulated the description and started looking into anyone who might match it. A week later we got a break. A man named Lucas Carver had been seen around the lake around the time of Eric's disappearance. He had a record petty theft assault and he had a scar on his cheek. We brought Lucas in for questioning. He was cocky, confident, the kind of guy who thought he was smarter than everyone else. But as we pressed him, his story started to unravel. He couldn't explain where he was. The morning Eric went missing and his alibi fell apart under scrutiny. I didn't kill him, Lucas and insisted, but there was fear in his eyes. We had enough to hold him, but we needed more. We searched his house and found Eric's phone hidden in a drawer. It was the smoking gun we needed. Under pressure, Lucas finally cracked. He admitted to confronting Eric about some money he claimed Eric owed him from a past business deal. When Eric refused, things got out of hand. Lucas attacked him, and in the struggle Eric fell and hit his head on a rock. Panicking, Lucas tried to hide the body in the lake. It was over. We had our killer. Lucas was charged with murder and sentenced to life in prison. Riverton slowly returned to its quiet, peaceful self, but things were never quite the same. Eric's death had left a mark on all of us for a while. I couldn't shake the feeling of unease every time I walked by the lake. I thought of Eric and how fragile life could be, but we carried on doing our jobs, protecting our town, and in the end that's all we could do. A year later, I found myself standing by the lake again, this time for a community event. The town had put up a memorial bench for Eric, a place for people to sit and reflect. As I looked out over the water, I felt a sense of peace. We'd brought justice for Eric, and while it couldn't bring him back, it meant something. Eddie walked up beside me handing me a cup of coffee, thinking about Eric. He asked, "Yeah?" I replied, "I still can't believe it happened me." "Neither," Eddie said, taking a sip, "but we did good, Clay. We got the guy." "Yeah, we did," I said, feeling a sense of closure. Life went on in Riverton. People laughed, loved and lived their lives, and though the memory of that dark time lingered, we moved forward, because that's what you do in a place like Riverton. You keep going one step at a time, holding on to the good and letting go of the bad. As I stood there watching the sun set over the lake, I knew that while we couldn't change the past, we could honor it by living well and protecting our community. And that's exactly what I intended to do. My name is Walter Rigg, and this all went down on September 14, 1986. I'm a search and rescue officer in the dense forests of northern Idaho around the Bitterroot Range. That day started off like any other, quiet, cool, and not a cloud in the sky. I just finished my morning coffee when the call came in. A hiker, Bill Jorgensen, had gone missing near Crater Lake. I knew the area well. It was off the beaten path, seldom trafficked except by the most adventurous types. Bill was supposed to return the previous evening, but never showed. His wife Linda called it in, panicked. We didn't waste any time. My partner, Rick Hayes, and I loaded up the truck with our gear and headed out. Rick was a good guy, solid and dependable. We'd been working together for over a decade. He had this way of cracking jokes at the most inappropriate times, but it kept things light. "Think we'll find him chilling by the lake fishing without a care?" Rick asked, as we bounced along the old logging road. I chuckled, knowing our luck. He'll be sitting there wondering what all the fuss is about. Crater Lake wasn't far, maybe an hour's drive and another hour's hike. The terrain was rugged, full of steep inclines and thick underbrush. Not the kind of place you'd want to get lost. When we got to the trailhead, we found Bill's car dusty but otherwise untouched. That was a good sign, meant he hadn't left the area. We started down the trail calling his name, pausing now and then to listen. The forest can play tricks on you, making every sound seem closer or farther than it is. About a mile in, we found something odd. Bill's backpack propped against a tree, undisturbed. It had some supplies, water, snacks, but no sign of Bill. Why'd he leave his pack? Rick wondered aloud, scratching his head. Maybe he went to take a leak and got turned around, I suggested, though it didn't sit right with me. We pressed on, following a faint trail that led deeper into the woods. After another hour or so, we came across a small campsite. There was a fire pit with some charred logs and a few scattered items: Bill's jacket, a map and a flashlight, but still no Bill. "Looks like he set up camp here," Rick said, picking up the map, "but where the hell did he go?" I shrugged, feeling a knot form in my stomach. Something wasn't adding up. As we searched the campsite, I noticed something odd about the ground, a series of deep irregular tracks leading away from the site. They didn't look like human footprints, more like large clawed impressions. What do you make of these? I asked Rick, pointing at the tracks. He squinted at them, then whistled. Whatever made those. It ain't something I'd want to run into. We decided to follow the tracks, hoping they'd lead us to Bill. The forest grew denser. The light dimmer as the trees closed in overhead. We kept calling out, but the only response was the rustling of leaves and the distant cawing of crows. After a while we found a clearing. In the middle was an old abandoned cabin, half collapsed and overgrown with ivy. Think he took shelter in there? Rick asked, nodding toward the cabin. Only one way to find out. I replied. We approached cautiously, flashlights cutting through the dim interior. The place was a wreck, broken furniture, rotted wood and a pervasive smell of decay. We called out for Bill, but there was no answer. As we turned to leave, something caught my eye, a dark stain on the floorboards, half hidden under debris. Blood. My heart pounded as I knelt down to get a closer look. It was dry, but there was enough of it to suggest something bad had happened here. I stood up, feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. We need to find him now, I said, urgency creeping into my voice. We left the cabin and continued following the tracks. They led us down a narrow, winding path that seemed to go on forever. The forest was eerily silent, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Then we heard a faint, anguished cry somewhere ahead. Did you hear that? Rick asked, eyes wide. Yeah, let's move. We picked up the pace, pushing through the underbrush. The cries grew louder, more desperate. Finally, we broke through to another clearing and saw him. Bill huddled against a tree, looking pale and terrified. His leg was mangled, blood seeping through his pants. Bill, thank God, Rick said, rushing over to him. Bill looked up, eyes wild. Get me out of here, he whispered, voice trembling. We got you, Bill. What happened? I asked as we started to assess his injuries. He shook his head, eyes darting around. It's still out there. It's coming back. What is? Rick asked, but Bill just shook his head again, too terrified to speak. We had to move fast. We fashioned a makeshift stretcher and started the arduous trek back to the trailhead. The whole time, Bill kept muttering about a creature, something with claws and teeth, something that had attacked him out of nowhere. I didn't know what to make of it, but the tracks and the blood made me uneasy. As we neared the trailhead, the light was starting to fade. The forest grew darker, the shadows longer. We were almost there when we heard it. A low, guttural noise like nothing I'd ever heard before. Bill's eyes widened in terror, and he started thrashing on the stretcher. It's here, he screamed. Rick and I exchanged a look, then turned to face whatever was coming out of the darkness. It emerged tall, hunched with eyes that seemed to glow in the dim light. It moved fast, too fast before we could react. It was upon us. Rick fired his gun, but the creature barely flinched. It knocked him aside like a rag doll, sending him crashing into a tree. I pulled my knife, slashing at it desperately. The blade connected, but it was like cutting into rock. The creature roared, swiping at me with claws that tore through my jacket and flesh. I fell back, gasping in pain. The creature loomed over me, but before it could strike again, Bill let out a defiant yell and threw a burning branch from our makeshift stretcher into its face. The creature howled, rearing back and giving us just enough time run. I shouted, grabbing and pulling him to his feet. We stumbled back to the trailhead. The creature's roars echoing behind us. We made it to the truck, threw Bill and Rick in and peeled out of there as fast as we could. As we drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the creature chasing us, but there was nothing, just the dark, silent forest. Back in town, we got Bill to the hospital. He was in bad shape but alive. Rick had a concussion and a few broken ribs, but he'd make it. We reported what happened to the sheriff, but when we took him and a search party back to the cabin the next day, there was no sign of the creature, just those eerie tracks and the blood stains. Bill never fully recovered from the ordeal. He moved away, didn't like talking about what happened. Rick and I stayed on the job, but we were never the same. The forest held a new kind of darkness for us, a reminder of what lurked beyond the trees. Sometimes when the nights are quiet and the wind rustles through the leaves. Just right, I think I hear it, that low, guttural noise, and I wonder if it's still out there waiting. Life went on, but we never forgot. The forest claimed its mysteries and we carried our scars, both seen and unseen. The legend of the creature grew whispered among locals and hikers. Some dismissed it as a story, a cautionary tale. But those of us who were there, we knew better. We learned to respect the unknown, the things that lurk just beyond the edge of the light. And though we never saw the creature again, its memory stayed with us, a shadow on the fringes of our minds, a reminder of the night. We faced something beyond our understanding in the years that followed. Search and rescue operations continued, but we approached each mission with a new weariness. Every broken branch, every unexplained noise brought back that night. We trained harder, stayed alert, and never took the forest's silence for granted. Rick and I talked about that night, sometimes usually over a beer. After a long day, we tried to make sense of it, to rationalize what we'd seen, but some things defy explanation. In the end, we accepted it as part of the job, part of the wild, untamed world we chose to work in. Bill never came back to Idaho. He sent us a postcard once from Arizona thanking us again for saving his life. He didn't mention the creature, but he didn't have to. We all knew what had happened and that was enough. As for me, I stayed on the job until retirement, always looking over my shoulder, always listening for that sound in the dark. My name is Eno Tully, and I used to live in a small quiet town called Baker's Ridge in Oregon. It was the kind of place where everyone knew each other, where news spread fast, and where the forest was as much a part of our lives as our homes and schools. I've always been a fan of hiking, a passion my dad passed down to me. He'd tell me the forest has a way of clearing your head, son, and I'd always find it to be true. Little did I know. Those same woods would later haunt me in ways I never thought possible. My story begins one day when I decided to take my usual hike up Old Man's Trail. It was a path less traveled, winding deeper into the forest than most dared to go. I had a day off from my job at the local hardware store, and I needed the solitude. Life in Baker's Ridge could be monotonous, and the forest was my escape. I packed my backpack with the essentials: water, some snacks, a map, and a sturdy knife. The knife was a gift from my grandfather who'd fought in the Korean War. Always be prepared, Enoch. He'd say I didn't own a gun, though many in town did. Guns weren't my thing. I trusted my instincts and my legs to get me out of trouble if need be. The first part of the hike was uneventful the way it usually was. The trees stood tall and silent, a canopy of green that blocked out much of the sky. Birds sang their songs and squirrels darted around, collecting whatever they could for the coming months. I followed the trail, enjoying the peace and the rhythmic crunch of leaves under my boots. It was around midday when I stumbled upon something unusual. I found a clearing I hadn't seen before, marked by an old dilapidated cabin. It looked like it had been abandoned for years, maybe decades. Curious, I approached it. The door creaked loudly as I pushed it open, revealing a dusty interior filled with broken furniture and the remains of what might have been someone's life long ago. As I looked around, I found a series of old newspaper clippings pinned to the wall, yellowed with age. They were about a series of disappearances in the 1970s. The names were unfamiliar, but the stories were eerily similar. People vanishing without a trace, all last seen near Old Man's Trail. A chill ran through me, but I shrugged it off. Probably just stories to scare kids away from wandering too far, I thought, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I decided it was time to leave, so I stepped back outside and resumed my hike. As the sun started to set, I realized I had ventured further than usual. The shadows grew longer and the forest around me seemed to change, becoming more thawing. I decided to turn back, not wanting to be caught in the woods after dark. That's when I heard a rustling in the bushes behind me. I stopped listening intently, probably just a deer, I muttered to myself, but then I heard it again closer. This time I turned my hand instinctively, going to my knife. Out of the corner of my eye I saw something move, something large and dark. My heart raced as I tried to make out what it was. It moved again, stepping into a patch of fading light, and I saw it clearly for the first time. It was a creature unlike anything I'd ever seen. It stood on two legs covered in dark fur, with a face that was a grotesque mix of human and wolf. Its eyes glowed with a predatory intelligence. I froze, unable to believe what I was seeing. The creature snarled, revealing a row of sharp glistening teeth. I backed away, slowly, my mind racing. How could this be real? I'd heard stories of werewolves as a kid, but I never believed in them. Now, standing face to face with one, I had no choice but to believe. It lunged at me and I reacted on pure instinct, slashing with my knife. The blade cut into its arm and it howled in pain, a sound that chilled me to the bone. I took the chance to run, adrenaline pumping through my veins. The forest blurred around me as I sprinted down the trail, the creature's footsteps heavy behind me. I ran faster than I ever had before, not daring to look back. My lungs burned and my legs felt like they might give out, but I kept going. I could hear the creature gaining on me, its breathing heavy and savage. I knew I couldn't keep this up much longer. In a desperate move, I veered off the trail, hoping to lose it in the dense underbrush. I ducked under branches, leaped over fallen logs and prayed for some kind of miracle. I found a small cave and squeezed inside, hoping it wouldn't find me. I sat there panting and trembling, trying to control my breathing. The forest was eerily quiet now, except for the sound of my own heartbeat. I listened intently for any sign of the creature. Minutes felt like hours and I dared not move. After what felt like an eternity, I heard it again, the rustling of leaves, the snapping of twigs. The creature was close, too close. I held my breath, clutching my knife tightly. The sounds grew louder, then stopped right outside the cave. I could hear it sniffing, searching for me. The terror was overwhelming, but I forced myself to stay calm. I knew that if it found me, I was done. For the seconds ticked by, each one a lifetime, and then, as suddenly as it had come, the creature moved away, its footsteps receding into the distance. I waited until I was sure it was gone before crawling out of the cave. My body HDHD, and my mind was racing. I needed to get back to town to warn everyone. I stumbled through the forest, using what little light remained to guide me. When I finally reached the edge of the woods, I collapsed onto the grass, exhausted and relieved, back in Baker's Ridge. I tried to tell my story, but no one believed me. They thought I was crazy, that I'd imagined the whole thing. Even my friends laughed it off, telling me I must have had too much to drink, but I knew what I saw. What I experienced. The creature was real, and it was still out there in the weeks that followed. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I stayed away from the forest, but the nightmares continued. I kept the knife close, always ready for another encounter, and then, just as suddenly as it began, the disappearances started again. People went missing one by one. The town was in a panic, but no one connected the dots, no one except me. I knew the creature was responsible, and I had to do something about it. I couldn't let it continue its reign of terror. I armed myself with whatever I could find, knives, a bat, even a flare gun, and headed back into the forest. I knew it was a suicide mission, but I had no choice. I had to protect my town, to stop the creature once and for all. I spent days tracking it, following the signs it left behind. Broken branches, claw marks on trees, the remains of its victims. It was a gruesome, horrifying task, but I pressed on. Finally, I found its lair, a hidden cave deep in the heart of the forest. The creature was there, resting unaware of my presence. I steeled myself, taking a deep breath, and moved in for the attack. I fired the flare gun, the bright light blinding the creature momentarily. It roared in pain and anger, but I didn't stop. I charged, swinging the bat with all my strength. The fight was brutal. Savage. The creature was strong, but I was fueled by rage and determination. I landed blow after blow, until finally it fell to the ground lifeless. I stood there panting, covered in its blood, victorious but broken. I returned to Baker's Ridge exhausted and traumatized. The disappearances stopped and life slowly returned to normal. But I was never the same. I carried the scars, both physical and mental, as a reminder of what happened. The town never knew the truth. They thought the disappearances were the work of some human monster, a serial killer perhaps. But I knew better. I knew the creature was real and I had faced it down. I saved my town, but at a great cost. Years have passed since that day and I still hike the trails, but I never forget. The forest is a place of beauty, but also of terror, and sometimes the things we think are just stories turn out to be all too real. In the end, I moved away from Baker's Ridge, seeking a new start in a place where the shadows of the past couldn't reach me. I settled in a small town in Montana, far from the forests of Oregon. Life here is quieter, simpler, but I never forgot what happened. I never forgot the creature and the horror it brought into my life. I told my story to a few trusted friends, but most of them just smiled and nodded, thinking it was just another tall tale. That's fine by me. I don't need anyone's validation. I know what happened. I know what I did, and that's enough for me. So if you ever find yourself in Baker's Ridge hiking Old Man's Trail, remember to stay on the path, and if you hear something in the bushes behind you, don't look back, just run. My name is Clyde Hargrove and I'm a park ranger. I've been working in the field for about 15 years now. You see, I always loved the great outdoors. Grew up in a small town in North Carolina, and the mountains and forests were my playground. Now I'm stationed in the Hawking Hills region of Ohio. It's a beautiful place, but something happened last year that changed my perspective on things. I was out on a routine patrol, doing my usual rounds. I wasn't alone, Mike and Jane. My fellow rangers were with me. We'd been having issues with folks getting lost and even some reports of missing persons lately. It wasn't uncommon for people to underestimate the wilderness, but this felt different. We all felt it. We set out early around sunrise, the fog still clinging to the treetops. The air was cool and the forest was just waking up. Birds were chirping and the occasional rustle of leaves let us know that the wildlife was starting to stir. Mike, always the joker, said, "Hey Clyde, you think Bigfoot's behind the missing folks?" We all laughed. Little did we know how close to the truth he was, though, not in the way you'd think. We reached a particularly dense part of the forest. It was darker here, the canopy almost completely blocking out the sun. The trees were ancient, their twisted roots creating natural obstacles. We had a map, but it was clear this part hadn't been explored much. That's when we found the first clue, an old weather-beaten backpack. It looked like it had been there for years. Jane picked it up and started rifling through it. "There's nothing in here, but some moldy clothes and a wallet," she said, frowning. The ID in the wallet belonged to a guy named Todd Wright, reported missing about a decade ago. This sent a chill through us. We pressed on, marking our trail as we went. After a while, we came across an old campsite. It looked like it hadn't been used in years. There was a fire pit, some rusted utensils and a tattered tent. The place gave off an eerie vibe, like it was frozen in time. Mike muttered, "This is starting to feel like a bad horror movie." As we were about to leave, Jane found something. It was a notebook half buried in the dirt. She handed it to me and I started flipping through the pages. Most of it was illegible, but there were some entries that stood out. Todd had written about seeing something in the woods. He described it as a tall, thin figure, with long limbs and eyes that seemed to glow in the dark. He wrote about hearing strange noises at night like whispers carried on the wind. We decided to head back to the ranger station to regroup on our way. We found more unsettling things: scraps of clothing, a broken watch, and even some bones. We couldn't be sure if they were human, but it was enough to make us uneasy. Back at the station, we reported our findings to the authorities. They promised to send out a search team, but we knew it wouldn't be enough. We decided to go back out the next day, this time better prepared and armed. Morning came and we geared up. I had my rifle. Mike had his shotgun and Jane carried a pistol. We ventured back into the woods following the same trail we'd marked the day before. The forest seemed different. This time more menacing. The usual sounds of wildlife were absent, replaced by an eerie silence. We reached the old campsite again and decided to split up, each of us taking a different direction to cover more ground. I went east, deeper into the forest. The trees here were even denser, and the air was thick with an earthy scent. As I walked, I kept my eyes and ears open, every sense on high alert. I don't know how long I'd been walking when I first saw it, a figure tall and thin standing among the trees. At first I thought it was a trick of the light, but then it moved. It was quick, almost was too quick for my eyes to follow. I called out, "Mike, Jane. You seeing this?" Static was all I got. In response, I decided to follow it, keeping my rifle ready. It led me to a clearing, and that's when I saw it up close. It was humanoid, but not human. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, and its eyes glowed with an unnatural light. It didn't have a face, not in the traditional sense, just a smooth surface, with those glowing eyes. Before I could react, it lunged at me. I fired my rifle, but it moved too fast. It hit me hard, knocking the wind out of me. I scrambled to my feet, firing again. This time I hit it, but it didn't bleed. Instead, a thick black liquid oozed from the wound. I don't know how long the struggle lasted. It felt like an eternity. I managed to get a few more shots in, but it was like trying to kill a shadow. Eventually it retreated into the woods, leaving me battered and bruised. I radioed Mike and Jane, telling them to meet me back at the campsite. When we regrouped, I told them what happened. Mike was skeptical, but Jane believed me. We decided to head back to the station and come up with a plan. We knew we couldn't leave whatever it was out there, especially if it was responsible for the missing people that night. We couldn't sleep. We sat around the table going over our options. Mike suggested we call in more reinforcements, but we knew it would take too long. We decided to go back out at first light, this time with a plan to trap it. Morning came and we set out again. We rigged up some traps using bait to lure it in. We waited for hours but nothing happened. Just as we were about to pack up, we heard it, a low, guttural sound like a growl. It sent shivers down my spine. The creature appeared just on the edge of the clearing. It was watching us. Those glowing eyes filled with malice. We stood our ground, weapons ready. It moved towards the trap and for a moment I thought we had it, but it was smarter than we gave it credit, for it avoided the traps and came straight at us. We opened fire. The noise deafening in the quiet forest. Bullets seemed to slow it down but not stop. It reached Mike first, slashing at him with its long claw-like fingers. He went down screaming Jane, and I kept firing, trying to get it away from him. It turned its attention to Jane, next knocking her to the ground. I aimed for its head, hoping to hit something vital. The shot connected and it stumbled back, giving me enough time to grab Jane and pull her to safety. Mike was bleeding badly, but he was still alive. We retreated, dragging Mike with us. The creature didn't follow. It stood at the edge of the clearing watching us with those glowing eyes. We made it back to the station. Mike barely conscious. We called for an ambulance and they airlifted him to the nearest hospital. Days turned into weeks and the creature was never found. The authorities dismissed our story, chalking it up to a wild animal attack. But we knew better. We knew what we saw, and we knew it was still out there lurking in the shadows. Mike survived, but he was never the same. Jane and I continued our work, but the forest felt different. It wasn't the peaceful place we once knew. Every time I go out on patrol, I keep my eyes and ears open, always on edge, always waiting. I don't know what that creature was and I don't think I ever will, but one thing's for sure, I'll never forget those glowing eyes watching us from the darkness, and I'll never stop looking over my shoulder, wondering if it's still out there waiting for its next victim. Sometimes when I'm out there alone, I think I can hear it, a rustle in the bushes, a shadow that seems to move just out of sight. It's probably just my mind playing tricks on me, but I can't shake the feeling that it's watching, waiting. Life goes on though. We patched up the trails, put up new signs and warned visitors to stay on the marked paths. But deep down I know it's not enough. That thing is still out there somewhere in the vast expanse of the Hawking Hills. I've thought about quitting, finding a job somewhere far away from the woods, but this place is a part of me. It's in my blood. So I stay, despite the fear, despite the memories. I stay because someone has to keep watch. Someone has to make sure it doesn't take anyone else. Mike and I don't talk about it much anymore. He's still a ranger, but he doesn't go into the deeper parts of the forest. I can't blame him. Jane, on the other hand, left not long after the attack. She moved to the city, took a desk job, said she couldn't handle the woods anymore. I don't hold it against her. I've kept Todd's notebook. It sits in my desk drawer, a reminder of what we faced. Sometimes I read through it, trying to make sense of his scribbles, trying to find some clue as to what that creature was, but it's all fragmented, like his mind was breaking down as he wrote it. My name is Felix Maddox and this happened to me in 2009. I was a struggling artist living in Denver, trying to make ends meet by waiting tables and selling a painting here and there. Life wasn't easy, but I always believed my big break was just around the corner. I had a bit of a reckless streak, always looking for adventure and new experiences, which is how I found myself agreeing to a weekend trip to a cabin in the woods with my buddy Tully Barrow. Tully was the kind of guy who could talk you into anything. He had an infectious energy and an endless supply of wild ideas. We'd been friends since high school, bonding over a shared love of bad horror movies and good whiskey. When he called me up one Thursday afternoon with the proposition of getting out of the city for a bit, I didn't need much convincing. Felix, man. You need a break. He said. I've got access to my uncle's cabin up in the Rockies. We can fish, hike, drink, whatever. It'll be a good time. I didn't hesitate. Count me in. When are we leaving? Tomorrow morning. Pack light. It's pretty remote, so bring some essentials. The drive up was beautiful. The mountains still dotted with patches of snow, despite it being late spring. Tully and I filled the hours with our usual banter, reminiscing about old times and debating which one of us would survive longer in a zombie apocalypse. The cabin was exactly what I imagined, rustic and isolated, surrounded by dense forest with a small lake, just a short hike away. It felt like stepping into a postcard. We spent the first day hiking and fishing, catching just enough trout to cook over a fire. That evening, after a few beers and a lot of laughs, the sky darkened and the stars came out in full force. It was peaceful, the kind of tranquility that makes you forget about all the worries of everyday life. The next day we decided to explore deeper into the woods. Tully claimed there was an old abandoned mining town somewhere nearby, and we both agreed it would be cool to check it out, armed with a couple of sandwiches, some water and Tully's never-failing optimism. We set off mid-morning following a rough trail that meandered through the trees. After a couple of hours of hiking, the trail became less defined. The forest thickened, the trees growing closer together, their branches interlocking like fingers. We pushed on, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were heading in the wrong direction. "Tully, you sure we are going the right way?" I asked, brushing away a cobweb that had strung itself across the path. "Absolutely, trust me, Felix. My uncle told me about this place. We just need to keep going a bit further." But the further we went, the more uneasy I felt. The forest seemed to grow darker, even though it was still early afternoon. There was a stillness that hadn't been there before, an absence of the usual sounds of nature, no birds, no rustling leaves, just an oppressive silence. After another half-hour of walking, we stumbled upon a clearing. At first I thought we'd found the abandoned town, but as we stepped into the open, it became clear this wasn't what Tully had described. Instead of crumbling buildings, there were crude wooden structures, almost like shacks arranged in a haphazard circle. They looked ancient, as if they'd been forgotten by time. "What the hell is this?" I muttered, more to myself than to Tully. He didn't answer. He was staring at one of the shacks, his face pale. "Felix, we need to go." There was a fear in his voice I'd never heard before. "What's wrong? What is this place?" "I don't know, but it feels wrong. We should leave now." I didn't argue something about the place, set my teeth on edge. We turned to head back the way we came, but before we could take more than a few steps, we heard a rustling like something moving through the underbrush. Tully froze and I scanned the tree line, trying to pinpoint the source of the sound. "Probably just an animal," I whispered, trying to convince myself as much as Tully, but then the rustling grew louder, closer. It was accompanied by a low guttural noise that raised the hair on the back of my neck. Tully grabbed my arm, his grip tight. "Felix, run." We bolted, crashing through the underbrush, the sound of something pursuing us growing louder with each step. I didn't dare look back, focusing only on the path ahead, trying to retrace our steps through the dense forest. My heart pounded in my chest, my breath coming in ragged gasps. After what felt like an eternity, we burst out onto the trail we'd been following earlier. We didn't stop running until the cabin was in sight. Only then did we dare to slow down, gasping for air and looking back the way we'd come. There was no sign of pursuit, but the forest felt different. Now, sinister inside the cabin. We bolted the door and collapsed onto the couch, still trying to catch our breath. Tully's hands were shaking and I realized mine were too. "What the hell was that?" I asked. "I don't know, man, but I've got a bad feeling. We should leave first thing tomorrow." I nodded in agreement. There was no way I was spending another night in those woods. We tried to settle down, but sleep didn't come easy. Every noise outside made us jump. Our nerves frayed. Sometime in the middle of the night I woke to a sound outside. It was faint, like someone or something moving around the cabin. I sat up, straining to hear. Tully was still asleep, snoring softly. I grabbed the flashlight from the table and crept to the window, peeking through the curtains. At first I saw nothing. Then, as my eyes adjusted, I noticed a figure standing at the edge of the tree line. It was tall, with long matted hair and an almost human-like shape. But there was something off about it. Its eyes glinted in the moonlight, reflecting an eerie animalistic intelligence. I felt a chill run down my spine. I backed away from the window, my heart pounding. I knew I should wake T, but I didn't want to make any noise. I grabbed the old hunting rifle Tully's uncle kept above the fireplace. I wasn't a great shot, but I figured it was better than nothing. I stood there clutching the rifle, listening. The figure didn't move. Just watched minutes passed, feeling like hours before it finally turned and melted back into the shadows of the forest. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. At dawn I woke Tully and told him what I'd seen. He didn't doubt me for a second. We packed up our things in record time and headed for the car. As we drove away, I glanced back at the cabin, half expecting to see the figure watching us, but there was nothing. We never spoke about that trip again. Tully and I drifted apart. After that, our lives taking different paths, I moved to New York chasing my dream of becoming an artist. Every once in a while, I'd hear about strange disappearances in the Rockies, and it would bring back memories of that weekend. Years later I saw Tully again, at a mutual friend's wedding. We exchanged pleasantries, but there was an unspoken agreement not to bring up the past. As the night wore on and the drinks flowed, Tully pulled me aside. "Felix, do you ever wonder what it was, that thing in the woods?" I shrugged, trying to play it off. "I try not to think about it. Whatever it was. It's behind us now." He nodded, but I could see the haunted look in his eyes. "Yeah, maybe, but sometimes I wonder if it's still out there watching, waiting." I didn't have an answer for him. Some things are better left unexplored. We raised a toast to old times and let the conversation drift to safer topics. But as I lay in bed that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd narrowly escaped something far worse than we could never comprehend. Life moved on, as it always does. I found success as an artist, married a wonderful woman named Lena, and had 2 kids. But every now and then, when the night is especially quiet, I think back to that cabin in the woods and the figure that watched us from the shadows. I wonder what would have happened if we hadn't run, and I thank whatever luck we had that we made it out of there alive. I've always been a skeptic, the kind of guy who rolls his eyes at ghost stories and conspiracy theories. It's 2002 and I'm just your average dude enjoying a camping trip with my buddies in the Cascade Mountains of Washington state. We'd been planning this getaway for months, and it was supposed to be the perfect escape from the grind of daily life. You know, campfires, fishing, bit of hiking and a lot of laughs. Let me introduce myself. My name's Lyndon Calder. I grew up in the Midwest, where the biggest thrill was sneaking into abandoned barns or trying to catch a glimpse of some rumored wild animal. I've always been into the outdoors, but I never imagined what was about to happen would change my perspective on reality. We arrived at our campsite in the late morning, just in time to set up before the afternoon sun got too oppressive. It was me, my college buddy, Horace Whitmore, and 2 guys from work, Felix Turner and Quincy Mitchell. We were all eager to unwind and crack open a few beers. The setting was idyllic, a clearing near a pristine lake surrounded by towering pines and the distant sound of a waterfall. We pitched our tents, gathered some firewood and set out to explore the area. Felix, the jokester of the group, kept us entertained with his terrible puns, while Quincy, always the cautious one, made sure we knew our way back. As the day turned into evening, we settled around the campfire. Felix was trying to tell a scary story, but his delivery was so bad it had us in stitches. Horace, the practical one, kept reminding us about safety, but we were too engrossed in our fun to care. "Lyndon, what do you think is the scariest thing out here?" Felix asked, smirking. "Probably your cooking." I shot back and everyone laughed, but soon the laughter died down and we started sharing more serious stories. Quincy mentioned a local legend about a creature that supposedly roamed these parts, a giant hairy beast. Of course I scoffed. "You guys really believe in Bigfoot?" I chuckled. "Come on, that's just a myth." Quincy shrugged. "Maybe, but people have gone missing in these woods. My uncle told me about it when I was a kid, said you could hear it at night." "Your uncle probably just wanted to keep you from sneaking out," Horace said, shaking his head. Felix was undeterred. "Well, let's see if we hear anything tonight. If it gets too creepy, we can always leave." The conversation moved on and soon we were just sitting around enjoying the crackling fire and the clear night sky. But there was an underlying tension. Like we were all waiting for something to happen. I don't know what time it was when we first heard it, a distant echoing howl that sent shivers through all of us. We looked at each other trying to laugh it off, but there was a palpable sense of unease. Probably just a coyote, Horus said, but his voice lacked conviction. We tried to ignore it and continued talking, but then we heard it again, closer this time, a deep, resonant sound that seemed to vibrate through the trees. What the hell is that? Felix whispered, his eyes wide. I don't know, but I'm not sticking around to find out. Quincy said, starting to pack up his things. Come on, guys, it's probably nothing, I said, but even I could hear the doubt in my voice. Felix decided to play the tough guy. Let's check it out, could be fun, right? Reluctantly, we grabbed our flashlight lights and started walking toward the sound. The forest was dense and the light from our torches barely penetrated the darkness. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig made us jumpy. After about 15 minutes, we found ourselves in a small clearing. The moonlight illuminated the area enough to see that there was nothing out of the ordinary. We stood there listening, but the forest had gone eerily silent. Maybe it was just an animal, Horus said, but his voice was trembling. Then we saw it, a massive shape moving through the trees. It was hard to make out, but it was tall, easily over 7 feet, and covered in dark fur. The creature paused, and for a moment we locked eyes with it. Felix, always the foolhardy one, took a step forward. Hey, who's there? The creature let out a guttural scream, a sound so intense it felt like it could split the earth. Felix froze, his bravado evaporating in an instant. Run! Quincy shouted, and we took off, crashing through the underbrush in blind panic. We didn't stop until we reached the campsite, panting and covered in sweat. We grabbed our essentials and decided to leave immediately. We didn't care about the rest of our gear. We just wanted to get the hell out of there. We piled into the car and sped down the dirt road, hearts racing. Nobody spoke for a long time, the adrenaline still coursing through our veins. Eventually Horus broke the silence. Did we really just see that? He asked, voice shaky. Yeah, man, we did. I replied, still trying to process what had happened. Felix, who had been unusually quiet, finally spoke up. Guys, we can't just leave our stuff there. And what if someone else goes up there? Are you crazy? Quincy snapped. I'm not going back. Maybe we should report it, I suggested, but who's going to believe us? The ride back to civilization was tense. None of us had any real answers, and we knew this story would sound insane to anyone. We agreed to keep it to ourselves for the time being. When we got back to town, we stopped at a diner to regroup over greasy burgers and endless coffee. We tried to make sense of what had happened, but there was no rational explanation. A few weeks later we heard on the news that a group of hikers had gone missing in the Cascade Mountains. It sent chills through all of us. We knew we had to do something, so we contacted the authorities and told them everything we saw. The authorities were skeptical, of course, but they promised to investigate. We never heard back from them, and the missing hikers were never found. The story died down and life moved on, but we were never the same. Felix moved away not long after. He said it was for a job, but I think he just couldn't handle being so close to those woods. Quincy started keeping to himself more, always looking over his shoulder. Horus and I stayed in touch, but there was a lingering tension, a shared secret that haunted our friendship. As for me, I try not to think about it too much, but every now and then when the night is still and the wind muzzles through the trees, I remember that scream. It's a sound that's burned into my memory, a reminder that there are things in this world we'll never fully understand. I don't camp anymore. The idea of being out in the woods, isolated and vulnerable, just doesn't appeal to me like it used to. Instead, I stick to safer pastimes, fishing on the lake, hiking well-marked trails. The adventure isn't worth the risk, sometimes late at night. I wonder if it's still out there, that creature we saw. Part of me hopes it's just a figment of our imaginations, a trick of the light in our minds, playing on our fears. But deep down I know better. There's something out there, something we can't explain, and it's better left alone. Life goes on, but the memory of that day stays with me. It's a reminder that we are not always the masters of our world, that there are forces out there beyond our comprehension, and maybe, just maybe, some legends are rooted in truth. I never saw Felix Quincy or Horace. Much after that, we drifted apart, each of us trying to forget in our own way, but every now and then I get a call from one of them. Usually late at night we talk about mundane things, work, family life in general, but there's always a pause, a moment of silence, where I know we are all thinking the same thing about that night in the Cascades and the thing we saw. I don't know if we'll ever truly understand what happened that day. Maybe it's better that way. Some mysteries are meant to stay unsolved, lurking in the shadows of our minds, reminding us that there are still wonders and terrors in this world that defy explanation. My name is Leon Tate and I'm the deputy sheriff in Crescent Falls, a town where nothing much happens. This story I'm about to tell you isn't one I've shared often. It happened back in 2014, and though years have passed, the events still haunt me, not in a ghost story kind of way, but in the way they force me to remember every detail vividly, as if I'm still there. I moved to Crescent Falls with my wife Dana and our 2 kids, Gabe and Emma, hoping for a quieter life, away from the hustle of the city. Dana works at the local library, and the kids go to the nearby school, making it a pretty typical small-town setup. But life has a way of turning the mundane into the extraordinary, and not always in a good way. It was just another Friday evening when everything started. I was on the late shift patrolling the outskirts of town. The sun had dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the empty streets. My radio crackled to life, and Carl the dispatcher came through. Leon, we've got a 10:57 over at the old mill, possible missing person. The Bakers reported their son Max didn't come home after football practice. Max Baker was a good kid, always polite and hard-working. It wasn't like him to disappear without a word. I swung my cruiser around and headed to the mill, a decrepit building that had been shut down for years, standing as a decaying monument to the town's once thriving industry. I pulled up to the mill and saw Max's bike leaning against the rusted fence. The place was eerie, with broken windows and graffiti scrawled across the walls. I radioed in my location and started my search, flashlight in hand. As I entered the mill, the musty smell of rotting wood and mold hit me. The floorboards creaked under my weight, and I had to watch my step to avoid falling through. I called out for Max, but only my echoes answered. After about 15 minutes of searching, I found his backpack near an old conveyor belt. The sight of it made my stomach knot. Just then my radio crackled again. Leon, we've got another report. Janice from the diner says her brother didn't come home either. Could be related. 2 missing kids in one night was more than a coincidence. I knew I had to keep looking, and fast. The old mill had several floors, each more decrepit than the last. As I climbed the rickety stairs, the air grew colder, and a sense of unease settled over me on the 3rd floor. I found something I didn't expect: a makeshift camp. There were empty food wrappers, a dirty blanket, and what looked like a journal. I flipped through the pages, but most of it was illegible, just scribbles and drawings. One word stood out though: huntsman, before I could make sense of it. A noise from behind startled me. I spun around, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. There, standing in the doorway, was a man I didn't recognize. He was tall, gaunt, and his eyes had a wild, almost feral look. "Who are you?" I demanded, my hand instinctively reaching for my gun. The man just smiled, a chilling grin that sent a shiver down my spine. "Names don't matter here," he said, his voice raspy, but you can call me Huntsman. My grip tightened on my gun. What are you doing here and where are the kids? Huntsman took a step closer, his smile never wavering. They are safe for now, but you, deputy, have a choice to make. You can try to save them or you can save yourself, but you can't do both. His words were like a punch to the gut. I didn't have time to think. I lunged at him hoping to subdue him and get some answers, but Huntsman was faster than he looked. He sidestepped my attack and shoved me into a wall. The impact knocked the wind out of me and before I could recover, he was gone, vanished into the darkness. I scrambled to my feet and radioed for backup. This is Deputy Tate. I need immediate assistance at the old mill. Suspect is dangerous, and the missing kids are here. I didn't wait for a response. I knew time was running out. I resumed my search, moving faster. Now, driven by a mix of fear and determination. On the top floor, I found a trapdoor leading to the roof. It was partially open and I could hear muffled voices from above. I climbed up, my heart pounding in my chest on the roof under the pale moonlight. I saw Max and Janice's brother Tim tied up and gagged. Standing over them was Huntsman holding a knife. Let them go. I shouted, aiming my gun at him. Huntsman turned to face me. His expression unreadable. You're too late, deputy. This is their fate and you can't change it. I fired a warning shot into the air, last chance. Let them go, or I will shoot. He laughed, a sound devoid of any warmth. Go ahead, then shoot. Before I could react, he lunged at the kid's, knife raised. I fired, hitting him in the shoulder, but it didn't stop him. He slashed at Max, who screamed in pain. I fired again, this time aiming for his leg. He dropped to the ground, the knife clattering away. I rushed forward and kicked the knife out of his reach. Tim was crying, his face pale with fear. I quickly untied both boys and called in their location. Within minutes backup arrived and Huntsman was taken into custody. Max was bleeding badly from a deep cut on his arm. I did my best to staunch the flow until the paramedics arrived. The kids were safe, but the night's events left a mark on all of us. Back at the station, I tried to get answers from Huntsman, but he remained silent. His eerie smile never fading. The journal we found at the mill was examined, but it offered little insight, just more scribbles in the occasional coherent sentence about the hunt and sacrifice. Huntsman was identified as a drifter with no fixed address, a man who moved from town to town, leaving chaos in his wake. He had no known family, no connections, just a long history of violence and mental instability. The weeks that followed were a blur of paperwork, media interviews and community meetings. The town was shaken, but life slowly returned to normal. Dana and I tried to shield Gabe and Emma from the worst of it, but the story was all anyone could talk about for a while. Max recovered from his injuries, though the psychological scars would take longer to heal. Tim's family moved away shortly after the incident, unable to bear the memories of what happened. As for me, I couldn't shake the feeling of failure. I saved the kids, but I couldn't prevent the trauma they endured. Huntsman was a reminder that evil can lurk anywhere, even in a quiet town like Crescent Falls. Years have passed since that night, but I still think about it often every time I drive past the old mill. I remember the fear in Max's eyes, the blood on my hands and the man with the chilling smile. I keep my gun a little closer now, and I patrol the town with a renewed sense of vigilance. Evil might be out there, but as long as I'm around, I'll do everything I can to keep it at bay. One evening, about 6 months after the incident, I sat down with Dana over a cup of coffee. We talked about everything that had happened, about our fears and our hopes for the future. It was then that I realized something important: no matter how dark the world might seem, there is always light to be found in the people we love, in the community we protect. We might not have all the answers and we might never understand the full extent of Huntsman's madness, but we have each other, and sometimes that's enough to face whatever comes next. Life in Crescent Falls continued, marked by the occasional small-town drama, but mostly filled with the rhythms of daily life. I watched Gay Babe and Emma grow up. Guided by the lessons learned from that fateful night, Dana and I grew closer, finding strength in our shared experiences, and in our commitment to keeping our family safe. If you're still craving more tales from the wild, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and join us on the next expedition.